We are going to be in several passages of Scripture this morning. We're going to start with a text in Proverbs 17. We are going to go to Hebrews chapter 12, but I will just read that passage to you. And then we'll be in James chapter 1 and in Job chapter 23. If you need a Bible, they're on this table back there. Feel free to go get one. Proverbs 17 is our text. The amplification of the text, James chapter 1 and Job 23. The way that I'm working on these studies through the book of Proverbs is I'm just reading through the book. And as the Lord brings a verse to me or a theme to me, I stop and say, okay, Lord, what is it that you want us to talk about here? And I'm reading along chapter 17 and verse 1, yeah, we talked about that. And verse 2, okay. And then I got to verse 3, and it was like, boing, you need to stop right here. The crucible for silver and the furnace for gold, but the Lord tests the heart. Now that brought me to a screeching halt. I can't even tell you what verse 4 says, because verse 3 brought me to a screeching halt. The Living Bible puts it this way: silver and gold are purified by fire, but God purifies hearts. And that's exactly what this verse means. The crucible for silver, the furnace for gold, that's how the impurities are taken out of silver and gold, but the Lord tests the heart. What is the fire that God uses to purify our hearts? Well, the tests and trials of life, right? That's how he tests us, through the tests and trials of life. And we all have them, right? I mean, we all know what it's like to go through the tests and trials of life. So those challenging days in life is how God is testing our hearts, how he's purifying our hearts. And it seems to me that those tests come from one of four sources. It is true that God chastens us. Hebrews chapter 12, the Hebrew writer talks about that. He says, verse 5, have you completely forgotten this word of encouragement that addresses you as a father addresses his son? It says, my son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline. Do not lose heart when he rebukes you, because the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as his son. Endure hardship, the tests and trials of life, as discipline. God is treating you as his children. In verse 8, he says, if you're not disciplined, then you're not legitimate, you're not true sons and daughters. And then he goes on and says, our human parents discipline us. How much more we should trust God when he disciplines us to make us what he wants us to be. Because he says in verse 10, he disciplines us for our good, in order that we may share in his holiness. And it does not seem pleasant at the time, but later on, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace. So he's saying there are times in our lives when God chastens us. Not everything that happens to us is because of God, but God does sometimes chasten us. And I think it's always appropriate when all of a sudden you start undergoing all kinds of tests and trials. Don't wallow in this and don't get deep in this hole, but it would be appropriate to just say, is God trying to get my attention about something? You know, have I allowed some stuff into my life that I need to be paying attention to? You know, is he trying to correct me about something? And, you know, stop. Again, don't get so introspective that you lose your joy, because, again, the Hebrew writer says, I'm writing this to you as encouragement. Because there are times when God's trying to get our attention. He's kind of smacking our hand, you know, and saying, uh-oh, get back on track, get back on course. So it's always appropriate when the tests and trials come to first just ask, could this be chastening from God because there's some sin in my life, there's something going on I need to straighten up? But it is also true that Satan brings things into our lives. Don't blame God for everything bad that happens to you. Sometimes it's the devil. When you become a Christ follower, The devil is going to do everything he can to mess you up. Just understand that. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul talked about a thorn in the flesh and called it a messenger of Satan. We're going to close our time this morning studying Job. And if you remember that story, Satan brought those things into Job's life. God set the limits, but it was an attack of Satan. So sometimes God chastens us, sometimes it's the devil. And the devil is bringing things into our lives to wreck us and ruin us. But sometimes, third, we bring trials on ourselves. Some of you remember Jack Parr. He said one time, as I look back over my life, I find that it was just a major obstacle course with me being the main obstacle. So sometimes we bring things on ourselves. And if you're honest, you know that's true. There's some things that you've gone through that you brought on yourself. It was just your own stupid decisions. It was your own foolishness. It was your own disregard of God's warnings. You brought it on yourself. Don't blame God for it. Don't blame the devil for it. Let's say, for instance, I mentioned to you my low blood sugar. Let's say, for instance, that you get word that Pastor Ken's in the emergency room in insulin shock. Now, if you hear anything like that, you are to drop everything you're doing and go be with Donna. Okay, that, just so you know that. You're to be down there with her. So you come down to the ER to see Donna, and you say, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. And she says to you, it's his own stupid fault. Serves him right. And you kind of, what? She says, you know he's not supposed to have sugar. Do you know that on the way home today from work, he stopped by Krispy Kreme and ate a dozen donuts? It's his own fault. Right? Right. God, I can't wake up from that diabetic coma and say, God, why did you do this to me? God said, I didn't make your car turn into Krispy Kreme. Or I rebuked the devil. And the devil says, hey, I've done a lot of stuff, but I didn't make your car turn into Krispy Kreme. Sometimes we bring it on ourselves. Right? Yes. Okay. And sometimes the tests and trials of life come because of the world in which we live. There are universal laws that if you break, you pay the consequences. You can jump out of a 12-story window if you want to. Chances are the law of gravity is going to take effect, and you may be doing pretty good for 11 stories, but once you hit the ground, if you survive, you're going to be hurting. God didn't do it to you. The devil did it to you. It's because of the world we live in, well, in your craziness, but because of the world we live in, the law of gravity, you broke it, you paid the consequence. This whole world, the Bible says, has been messed up because of sin. And in Romans chapter 8, starting in verse 19, Paul says that just as we groan waiting for heaven, you ever have one of those days where you just say, Lord, this would be a great day for you to come back and take us all to heaven? So the whole planet, the Bible says, is groaning, waiting for its redemption, waiting for the Creator to come back and create the new heavens and the new earth and set things back on track. And I don't think we have any idea of the suffering and sickness and trauma in the world because of the world we live in. Jesus says it rains on the just and the unjust. Sometimes that rain is in the right amount at the right time, and evil people get a harvest. Sometimes that rain is a hurricane, and good people suffer. God didn't do it, the devil didn't do it, they didn't bring it on themselves. It's the world in which we live, and it's so messed up that we pay the consequences for being in that world. So tests come from one of those four ways. But the good news is that God tests and purifies our hearts through those tests and trials. He uses them to purify us regardless of the source of those tests. God uses them, if we'll let Him, for our good. That's what Romans 8:28-29 says. God is at work in everything for the good of those who love Him. And verse 29 says, because His plan for us is that we be conformed to the image of His Son. one of the biggest challenges I had in putting this lesson together was what to leave out. Because there's so much that I want to talk about the tests and trials of life, and I'm trying to keep focused on this passage. But the reality of God's promise is that even those things that the devil brings against us, if we will stay surrendered to God, He will turn them for good. It's the story of Joseph. His brothers sell him into slavery, and 13 years later, when they come back and they need him to give them food, he says to them, "You meant it for evil, God meant it for good." And we need to understand that no matter even the things that we bring on ourselves, God is able to turn them for good. And the good is that we will be like Jesus, that we will be conformed to the image of His Son. That's what it means to be purified. That's what the goal of God testing our hearts is, so that we will be like Jesus. The Proverbs verse talked about the crucible for silver. A tourist had stopped by a silversmith's shop years ago and watched as he heated that crucible for that silver, hotter and hotter, and the silversmith was just staring into that crucible. And the tourist said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm looking for my reflection." Because the heat is taking out the impurities of the silver. And when the silver is pure, I can see myself in it. And then I know it's ready. Christ allows the heat to get turned up. And no matter who's turning up the heat, He is working in it to see Himself. That we will be the image of His Son. The question is then, how do we respond when the tests and trials come? James chapter 1. He tells us to count it pure joy when we face trials of many kinds. And then he tells us why. Because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. The first thing that we must do when the tests and trials come is to know, K-N-O-W, that God is working. Again, it doesn't matter the source of those trials. Know that God is at work in all things for the good of those who love Him. And in this case, James says, those trials and tests produce perseverance. The King James uses the word endurance. It means literally the ability to hold up under pressure. When Brian was coaching high school sports, his parents and not Donna and me, his team parents and fans wondered why he would schedule some of the games he scheduled. Because they said, "We don't have a chance against that team." And he said, "My team needs to learn." And you don't learn by playing somebody you can beat 70-0. You learn by being tested. And James says the way you learn and develop endurance, the ability to stand up under pressure, the ability to stick with it, is by going through these tests and trials. Andre Crouch wrote a lot of great songs, but Through It All may be one of the best ones that he wrote, because he says in it, if I never had a problem, I'd never know that God could solve it, and I'd never know that what faith in God could do. Through it all, I've learned to trust in Jesus. Through the tests and trials, we know that God is working. And how else do we know that we can trust God, but that we trust Him? Anybody can trust God when everything's going your way, but when the reverses come and you see God come through, you learn to trust Him. Then he says, verse 4, let perseverance finish its work, so that you can be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Let God work. We can hinder the work of God in our lives. You do realize that, right? We can rebel against Him. We can refuse to allow Him to work. We can just go ahead and try to do things our own way, and we don't let Him work. He says, let perseverance finish its work. Heard about a person who said, God, you said that you would paint a beautiful picture in my life. And God said, I tried to, but you kept getting down off my easel. Right? We have to cooperate with God. We have to let Him do His work. Don't short-circuit Him. We sang this morning, Blessed Assurance, Jesus is mine. The third verse, perfect submission, all is at rest. The way you get rest is surrendering to God. The way you develop through the tests and trials is surrendering to the process, surrendering to the work. Next week, I'm going to give you an illustration of this principle from the book of Jeremiah. When Jeremiah goes to the potter's house and sees how a potter makes a beautiful vase. It's an illustration of God using the tests and trials of life to make something beautiful of us. And we're going to take the whole morning next week and look about that. But what is His goal for us? That we be mature and complete. The King James says perfect and entire. The word perfect or mature means we're like Christ, the Romans 8 passage. The word entire means that we are complete, able to handle what comes our way. Now just drop down a few verses and look at verse 12. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because, having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love Him. That kind of sounds like God working together for good, doesn't it? If you hang in there through the tests and trials, you'll receive the crown of life. But it's not easy. I told you a couple of weeks ago, God is certainly at work through all this process, but I'm not necessarily enjoying the process. And so what do you do when the tests and trials of life come and you're not quite sure how to handle it? Well, this is why he says in verse 5, so we're still in James 1, if any of you lack wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault. It will be given. But when you ask, believe and don't doubt. That's a verse we use for a lot of things. And we should use it for a lot of things. But it's significant that the context of, if you lack wisdom, ask God, is when you're going through trials. Because sometimes if we're not careful, when you go through the tests and trials of life, you kind of lose your focus on God, and you kind of lose sight of Him, and you just kind of flailing around. So James says, as you go through the challenges of life, pray. Say, God, I need wisdom. I need to know how to react to this. I need your strength to be able to deal with this in my life. And He will give it to you as you pray without doubting. One of the great illustrations of how to handle trials is Job chapter 23. Back in the Old Testament, right before Psalms and Proverbs, is the book of Job. Or when you preach on it Labor Day Sunday, it's the book of Job. Y'all aren't even paying attention. Or maybe it wasn't worth being paid attention to. Job 23. I'm not going to give you the whole detail of the story of Job. I'm assuming you're fairly familiar with it. But God and Satan had a conversation, and God said, where have you been? And Satan said, I've been out looking around. And God said, have you run into Job yet? And Satan said, well, yeah, but he serves you because everything's going his way. And God says, okay, I'm going to give you permission to do some testing. And Job basically lost everything he had. All of his children died. All of his livestock was gone. I mean, he pretty much lost everything he had. How do you handle those tests and trials of life? Well, his dilemma starts in verse 3. If only I knew where to find Him, that is God. If only I could go to His dwelling, I would state my case before Him and fill my mouth with arguments. My translation or my paraphrase of that is, I wish to goodness I knew where God was, because I have a few things I want to talk to Him about. You've probably had those days. God, where are you? I've got some questions. I've got some statements. I need to talk to you about some things. He can't find God anywhere. He says in verse 8, if I go to the east, he's not there. If I go to the west, I don't find him. When he's at work in the north, I don't see him. When he turns to the south, I catch no glimpse of him. In other words, it's kind of like he's saying this. I talked to one of my friends, and they said if I went to this seminar, I'd get help. I went to that seminar, there was no help. One of my other friends said if I buy this teaching series, then that would give me the answers. And I bought the teaching series, and there wasn't anything. Somebody else told me if I prayed an hour a day, and I prayed an hour a day, and I got nothing. Somebody else said, well, what you need to do is fast, and so I fasted, and I still didn't get anything. No matter where I go, I can't find God. God and all evidence of him is gone. It's just darkness. I do not know where he is. I wish I could find him because things are going bad for me and I need some answers. If you've not been there yet in your life, call me when you get there, because we all get there at some point or another. Say, God, what in the world's happening here? But he gets to verse 10 because somehow, even thousands of years before James was written, Job understood, knowing that the trying of your faith works perseverance, letting God having his work, because he says, but he knows the way that I take. And when he has tested me, that sounds like Proverbs 17, doesn't it? The Lord tests the heart. When he has tested me, I will come forth as gold. That's our text. The crucible for silver, the furnace for gold, that's how the impurities are out. The Lord uses the fire of the tests and trials of life to purify our hearts. Job's perspective is what this verse is. God is at work. I don't know where he is, but he knows where I am. I don't have all the details of this illustration, so if it messes up, I'm sorry. But I remember reading some story somewhere about a young man who was blind, and it had happened as a result of an accident or something. And his father kept kind of stretching him as far as, you can do this, you can do this, you can do this. And at one point, the young man was complaining to one of his friends how much his dad was making him do so that he could be as independent as possible. And his friend looked at him, he didn't realize it, and said to him, you don't know, do you? And he said, what? He said, your dad was right behind you the whole way. Everything you've been doing, he's been right there. That's what Job says. I can't see him, but he knows where I am. And wherever I go, he's right there. And that's the good news. Even when you can't see God, he knows exactly where you are. God is at work. But don't miss this. When he has tested me, I will come forth. Somebody asked an old saint, what is your favorite Bible verse? And she said, and it came to pass. I said, what? How can that be your favorite Bible verse? It came to pass. She said, well, sometimes I think it came to stay, but it didn't. It came to pass. I said, okay. And this too shall pass. And that's what Job is saying. When he has tried me, I will come forth. There's going to be an end to this. It may be in this earth, it may be when we get to heaven, but there will be an end to this, and I will be gold when it's done. The crucible for silver, the furnace for gold, the tests and trials of life for us, as God uses them to get rid of the impurities, to make us more like Jesus, so that when people see us, they see Christ in us, and we come forth as gold. So Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, our light and momentary troubles. Now that's convicting right there. Whenever you've had a bad day, read Paul's biography, and how many times he was shipwrecked, and how many times people threw stones at him, and how many times he was whipped, and how many times he was put in prison, and all the things he went through, and he dares to call them light and momentary troubles. They are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So, Because we have a challenge to remember that. We fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen. Because what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. In my early ministry, when I preached on this passage of Scripture, I stopped at that verse, and that was a horrific mistake. Because the reason Job could say, he knows the way that I take, and when he has tried me, I'll come forth as gold, is because of his obedience that he describes in verses 11 and 12. Job's obedience. My feet have closely followed his steps. I have kept to his way without turning aside. I have not departed from the commands of his lips. I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my daily bread. See, the temptation is when the struggles come, when the tests and trials come, that we turn our back on God. It's like, if you're going to let this happen to me, see if I serve you. Job said, I've followed his steps. I've kept his way. I've not departed from his commands. I've held on to his word. His obedience is what got him through. So how does God purify us? How does he make us more like Jesus? By using the difficulties of life. No matter where they come from, God can use them to make us more like Christ, to make us pure gold, to make us what he wants us to be, so that he can see the image of Christ in us. So the song we often sing, trust and obey. There's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. You got to trust that he's working, trust that he knows what he's doing, and stay obedient through the tests and the trials. And you too will come forth as gold. Father, this is a lesson that we so desperately need to be reminded of, at least I do, pretty frequently. That no matter the reason for the challenges of life, you will work through them to make us like Christ. And that's your ultimate goal for us, that good that you are working. But we also know that beyond this earth, there's that crown of righteousness that is awaiting those who persevere through the tests and trials of life. And we know that what we go through on this earth is working for us, as Paul said, an exceedingly eternal weight of glory. Thank you for that assurance and that promise. And so, Lord, whatever it is that those of us in this room and those who are listening or watching online are going through, may we be reminded that you are at work, and as we stay true to you and obedient to you, we will come forth as gold. And now may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine on you and give you his peace now and evermore. Amen. God bless you. Thanks for coming out today. You're dismissed.